Hello, adult Sunday school leader. Hey, I can remember when I first started teaching Sunday school, well over 30 years ago. I reflected on some of my Sunday school teachers in the past and maybe even some high school and college teachers who I thought really didn't do that great of a job. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to be doing what they did. Well, just like we can learn what to do from the good example of other people, we can also learn from the poor example of others what not to do. Now, so far in this unit, we've been looking at positive examples of how to serve alongside someone. But there are examples of biblical sidekicks whom we can learn what not to do. And that's what we're going to be looking at this week as we continue in the unit called More Than a Sidekick, Serving Alongside Others. This is the fifth lesson. It's about Haman. The focal passage is going to be out of Esther chapter 3 and chapter 6. And the point of the lesson is, whatever you do, do it with humility. Well, pride can be a good thing. When you work hard toward a goal and you achieve it, that feeling proud, that's natural, and it's a positive response. It builds confidence and encourages self-improvement. But the flip side of pride is when one's confidence turns into arrogance and feelings of superiority. And that's where we're going to find the subject of our study this week, Mr. Haman. Well, this week we're going to be in the book of Esther. It's the only book in the Bible that does not mention God. However, God's fingerprints are all over this story. It's also one of two books that's named after a woman. What's the other one? Ruth. Well, before we get into the story, there are some names you might find difficult to pronounce, so I suggest working on these before getting to class. So we've got the king. That's King Ahasuerus. And depending on your translation, you may have Xerxes instead of Ahasuerus, okay? So it's the same name, just referred to differently. So you got Ahasuerus, you got Xerxes, Mordecai. I always say Haman. It's probably technically Haman. I just like the way the name Haman sounds, so I'm saying Haman. And Hamadatha, and Agagite, and Zeresh. Well, let's first quickly set the background. Okay, the author of this book, the author of Esther, it's unknown. The time frame for the book occurs after the Babylonian exile, when Persia had replaced Babylon as the ruling power. The story is set in the city of Susa. It's one of the Persian capitals during the reign of King Xerxes. I like the way that sounds better than Ahasuerus. Well, this story takes place around 486 to 464 BC. And during this time, some Jews had returned to Jerusalem where they enjoyed a reasonable amount of control over their own affairs. But there's others like Esther and Mordecai in our story that were still in exile. Well, as a minority group, the Jews were viewed with suspicion and sometimes faced threats to their existence. And as we'll see in this lesson, there are some similarities between this story and Nazi Germany almost 100 years ago. Well, Esther, through a series of events, and it's too much to mention here, she becomes King Xerxes' queen. Mordecai, Esther's cousin, learned of a plot to assassinate the king, so he told Esther, who told the king, and she credited her cousin Mordecai. Well, that takes us to our first set of scriptures. We're going to be in Esther chapter 3, looking at verses 1 through 5, and here we're introduced to this guy named Haman. We don't know a lot about his background here, but there are just a few clues to who he was in these verses. We know his father was Hamadatha, but that really doesn't help us much. That's the only place this guy's mentioned. We also see that he was an Agagite. Well, that could mean a couple of things. Maybe he was either from an area in the empire known as Agag, or that he was a descendant of King Agag, or Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Now, if you remember, the Amalekites attacked the Israelites after their exodus from Egypt, and Joshua won that victory over the Amalekites, but God declared that he would one day wipe out these people. And God commanded Saul to do that. But Saul let some of those Amalekites live. So this might be the reason that Haman is called an Agagite. And if that's so, then it's easy to understand why Haman had such a hatred for the Jews. And we'll see how that hatred actually backfired on him here in a bit. Well, the king promoted Haman to be the top officer in the empire, a higher rank than any of the other nobles in the empire. And the king commanded that everyone kneel, everyone bow at Haman's presence and pay honor to him. So why didn't Mordecai do so? Mordecai may not have liked him, but he could have at least shown some kind of respect for the position. Well, we can see several instances of Jews bowing to others. It seemed to be okay. David bowed to Saul. We see that in 1 Samuel 24:8. In Genesis 33, verses 3 and then 6 and 7, we see that Jacob bowed to Esau. Jews even bowed to each other, 2 Samuel 14:4 and 18:28. So if it was okay to bow to someone, why didn't Mordecai do it? And what does his being a Jew have to do with all this anyway? You know, it's interesting at the end of verse 4 that it states that Mordecai told the people at the gate that he was a Jew. Well, how does that figure into all this? Well, here's one possibility, and I kind of lean this way, that if Haman was indeed an Amalekite, I believe that Mordecai refused to honor someone whose ancestors were always an enemy to God's people. Plus, possibly he didn't want his bowing to be interpreted as an act of worship of any kind. You know, as far as I know, this is the only recorded act of civil disobedience in the Bible. Sometimes you just have to stand up for what's right, even if it puts you in danger. Do you know the name August Landmesser? He's thought to be the man in this picture taken on June 13th, 1936. It was at a German shipyard where the launching of a German Navy training ship was happening. Everyone in the photo has their arm raised in a Nazi salute except this one man. Just like this guy, sometimes you may be the only one standing for what's right, but peer pressure or the pressure of the thought of a loss of a job or even your life, it's not a reason to compromise what God's commanded. Regardless of the reason, though, let's get back to Mordecai here. Regardless of the reason, Mordecai didn't bow, and this infuriated Haman. Well, our next set of scriptures continues in this chapter in verses 6 through 9. Haman's hatred had grown from just being toward one man to an entire people group. He was determined to exterminate the people he hated. And here we see the similarities to Nazi Germany. Haman identified the Jews as a threat to civilization, and he called for their annihilation. But where in the world would Haman get 375 tons of silver? Most likely his plan was to loot the Jewish people's property after he had killed them. This is another similarity to the Nazis. Well, a lot happens here between this passage and our next passage. I'm going to try to briefly summarize that. Mordecai learns about Haman's decree to destroy the Jews, and he's devastated. He mourns publicly, wearing sackcloth and ashes. Esther, unaware of the decree, sends a messenger out to find out what's troubling Mordecai, and he explains the situation and urges her to go to the king and plead for her people. Well, Esther, she's initially hesitant because approaching the king without being summoned could lead to her death. Well, Mordecai reminds her that she might have just been placed in this royal position for this very reason, to save her people. Encouraged, Esther asks Mordecai and the Jews to fast for 3 days. And then she resolves to approach the king, saying, "If I perish, I perish." Well, on the 3rd day, Esther dresses in her royal robes, approaches the king. The king is pleased to see her, extends his scepter and allowing her to approach. Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet she has prepared. At the banquet, the king asks Esther, "What do you desire?" and promised to grant her a request, even up to half his kingdom. Well, instead of making her request immediately known, Esther invites the king and Haman to another banquet the next day where she said she will reveal her petition. Well, Haman leaves the banquet pleased, but when he sees Mordecai still refusing to bow to him, he becomes enraged. Haman's wife and his friends suggest, "You need to build some gallows and hang Mordecai." And Haman eagerly proceeds with that plan. Well, that night, the king's unable to sleep, so he orders the record of his reign to be read to him. And in the records, he discovers that Mordecai had previously uncovered a plot to assassinate him. And the king asks his attendants what honor had been given to Mordecai, and they inform him that nothing had been done. At that very moment, Haman enters the court, and he intends to ask the king for permission to hang Mordecai, but before Haman can speak, the king asks him, what should be done for the man who the king wishes to honor? Now, assuming the king is referring to him, Haman suggests an elaborate public honor, dressing the man in royal robes, placing him on the king's own horse, leading him through the city streets, proclaiming, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. That takes us to our last set of scriptures, Esther chapter 6, verses 10 through 14. Then do that for Mordecai, exclaimed the king to Haman. Do everything you mentioned. Don't leave out anything. So Haman did what he was told, and that had to be humiliating for him to do that. Haman ran off to complain to his wife and friends, who prophetically told him that his end had to be near. Now, you certainly don't have enough time to cover the entire story of Esther, but you need to be prepared in case someone in your class has a question or comment about other portions of the story that aren't mentioned. Since there's so much to this rich story, I'd advise reading the entire book of Esther at least once this week. It's only 10 chapters, not very long. But remember, as interesting as the whole story is, this lesson isn't about communicating that entire saga. It's about making the point about what not to do when you're working for someone or you're someone's sidekick. As we look at Haman's attitude through the little bit of the story that we looked at, we can see he was everything that the Lord hates. Let's read Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19. Here's what it says. There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. That's Haman. Well, haughty eyes, or haughty, means arrogantly superior and disdainful. That's Haman. He was prideful. He was infuriated when he thought he wasn't getting the respect he deserved. You see, the way people handle praise and promotion and authority, it shows their character. His pride was also evident when he assumed the king was talking about him when he walked in on him. Well, when we work alongside someone, let's not reflect Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19. Instead, let's reflect Galatians 5, 22 through 23, that says this about the fruit of the Spirit. What is it? It's love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Also keep in mind this, Proverbs 11, verse 2. When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. And that ties right in with the point of the lesson. Whatever you do, do it with humility. Well, next week we're going to be concluding this unit as we examine the example of Baruch from the book of Jeremiah. So thank you guys again so much for watching. Don't forget, pray for and with your class.